This is Clarence Horton. On behalf of Cabarrus County and all the people and organizations who are working to preserve her heritage and her history, welcome to another historical moment in the story of Old Cabarrus. This is the second segment in our series on the settlement of the eastern or Dutch side of Cabarrus County and the neighboring areas of Rowan County by German-speaking people who were of the Lutheran and of the Reformed faiths. Although the Lutherans came in much larger numbers than their Reformed cousins, the Reformed people worked hard, not only to cultivate the land, but to build churches, to start schools, and to pass along their heritage and customs and traditions to their children. They were reluctant to give up their German language, and their schools generally taught German in the lower grades. German was still spoken in many of the churches in Rowan and Cabarrus County during the early years of the 19th century. Reverend John Nance, who preached here at Lower Stone Church between 1837 and 1853, actually preached sermons in both German and English. Later in the century, in 1883, hundreds of people came from miles around to hear Reverend Horn preach a sermon all in the German language at Mount Zion Church in present-day China Grove. Although the land in the eastern part of the county was not as rich as that in the western portion, the farmers were great husbandmen. They raised flocks, they raised small grain, corn and other small grains with which to feed those flocks. They were frugal and they managed to prosper. They were also great workers in wood and in stone. They were architects and builders. They built houses and walls and churches, which have endured to this day in Cabarrus and Rowan counties. Their wives were famous for their well-laden dinner tables, set with the usual German sweets and sours. They were most well known, however, for their breads and pies, pastries and desserts, many of which were prepared in Dutch ovens, such as the one shown behind me here. Their churches were the social center of their communities. No sooner had they moved onto the land, built some sort of shelter and planted a crop for the coming year, than they began to meet together, to pray together and to read sermons. There were no ministers among them then, so they could not have the sacraments administered. But they met together, and their elders read from printed books of sermons they brought from the old world. They sang hymns without musical accompaniment, and they prayed together. And in that little community of faith, they prospered. The Reformed people claim as their spiritual ancestor a Catholic priest named Ulrich Zwingli, who persuaded the churches of Zurich in Switzerland to incorporate some of his ideas for reforming the church from within. In an ensuing religious war, Zwingli, who was serving as a chaplain, was unfortunately killed. The Lutherans traced their ancestry back, of course, to Martin Luther in Germany. Both the Lutherans and the Reformed people, however, share a Reformation faith, divided only by some doctrinal differences about the meaning of the Lord's Supper. In about 1745, the German settlers in southern Rowan County built their first church out of native wood. It was built out of hickory logs, and they gave it the characteristically simple name of the Old Hickory Church. That building, which is gone now, stood about 7 miles from the present location of Lower Stone Church, and its former location is marked with a monument which was erected so that the German people of Rowan and Cabarrus counties could remember one of their mother churches. Both Lutheran and Reformed people worshiped together at Old Hickory Church in what we call a union congregation, sharing the facilities there together. In 1774, however, the Lutheran members withdrew and decided to build their own church of native stone. That great church, which was completed in 1795, became the modern-day Zion or Oregon Lutheran Church. In that same year of 1795, their Reformed cousins decided to build their own stone church in the German tradition and began construction of what became lovely Lower Stone Church, located at the intersection of Lower Stone Road and Beatty Ford Road here in southern Rowan County. Construction of that church continued on for several years. We know that it was completed at least by 1811, as that was a year of a significant dedication service honoring the completion of this new house of God. It still stands on the same location where it served the German Reformed people of southern Rowan County for all these past years. Although there were no resident ministers in those early days, people were blessed with occasional visits from various itinerant missionary preachers, such as Reverend Christian Theus, whose home was actually in South Carolina, but who occasionally journeyed to this area to preach to the people and to administer the sacraments. Later, he was joined by a Swiss minister, Reverend James Martin, who came among the people in 1759. Finally, in 1764, a French Reformed minister named Dupère came into the area and occasionally preached at the various Reformed and Lutheran churches in Cabarrus and Rowan counties. By 1768, perhaps our best-known Reformed minister, the Reverend Samuel Souther, was preaching to a Union, Reformed, and Lutheran congregation gathered at Old Coldwater Church in Cabarrus County. Reverend Souther preached until 1771 throughout this entire area, and his preaching unified and united the Reformed churches of central North Carolina. Following the Revolution, Reverend Souther returned to the churches here in Rowan and Cabarrus County, where he preached until 1786, finally removing to the Orangeburg district of South Carolina, where he later died. Reverend Andrew Loritz, another Swiss minister, came to North Carolina in 1786 and did great work among the people until his untimely death in 1812. During those same years, another great Reformed minister, the Reverend Samuel Weiberg, preached to congregations in both Cabarrus and Rowan counties. He was a strong and effective minister and much beloved of the people. But they have a strong missionary tradition, and they reluctantly gave Reverend Weiberg permission to leave their churches and to go as a missionary to serve the people in far-off Louisiana. Reverend Weiberg reluctantly did so and became the first Protestant missionary to the people on the western side of the Mississippi River, where he preached the first Protestant sermon. Later, he was joined by Reverend Jacob Christman, another Reformed minister who also became a missionary to the people living in Ohio. In addition to Grace Lowerstone, another strong Reformed congregation grew up in Rowan County in the mid-1700s at a location which is now south of present-day China Grove. Originally called Savitz or Savage Church after a prominent local family, the church soon assumed its present-day name of Mount Zion. There, both Lutheran and German Reformed members worshiped together in a union church for many years. They replaced the original log church with a small frame church painted red. Unfortunately, a deranged member of the local community associated the color red with the color of Satan and burned the church. The congregation rebuilt another frame church where they worshiped together until about 1836. In 1836, the Lutheran members withdrew from the Mount Zion congregation and built their own church at a nearby location where today they worship and prosper as Lutheran Chapel. The remaining Reformed members purchased 4 acres of land from Catherine Partee for about $40 and built another brick church on the site in which they worshiped for many years. After the Civil War, Mount Zion was placed on a charge with nearby St. Paul's Reformed Church in Enigville, which had just been newly formed. The Mount Zion congregation itself set about to raise funds to build a new brick sanctuary. Unfortunately, that beautiful new sanctuary was lost to fire in 1918 when Reverend John Keller was pastor of the church. They immediately set about to rebuild the sanctuary, led by James Fleming, a member of the congregation, who gathered pledges of more than $10,000 to assist with the rebuilding, a very significant sum in those days. The congregation was also able to complete the sanctuary by 1919 and dedicate it in 1920. They raised additional funds in order to bring these beautiful stained glass windows from Germany. Mount Zion has remained faithful throughout the years to the missionary tradition of the Reformed Church. In 1916, its pastor, Reverend John Keller, preached to the Reformed people at the YMCA in Kannapolis. As a result of his efforts and those of others, beautiful new St. John's Reformed Church was built in North Kannapolis in 1919. Also in 1919, 65 members of the Mount Zion congregation withdrew in order to form a vital new Reformed church at nearby Landis. The congregation at Mount Zion also established a mission in Rogers Park, a growing area of North Kannapolis. That mission grew into Rogers Park Evangelical and Reformed Church, which has carried on a vital ministry in that neighborhood for these many years. In Cabarrus County, a third strong Reformed congregation traces its lineage back to old Coldwater Union Church on Gold Hill Road, now known as Coldwater Lutheran Church. In the early days of its beginnings in 1766, the church served both Reformed and Lutheran people. In 1843, however, the Lutheran members of the Coldwater congregation withdrew and built a new church, St. James Lutheran Church in Concord. The remaining members floundered without a leader for some period of years, but in 1851, the Reverend Jeremiah Ingold came to breathe new life into the congregation. Reverend Ingold found a lot on the old road from Concord to Salisbury and established a church there, which was first known as Mount Gilead and later as New Gilead. In 1853, Dr. Ingold was able to enlist the aid of a strong worker, John Heilman. Mr. Heilman was then a member of the Mount Zion congregation at nearby China Grove. He was also a trained artisan, a worker and craftsman, expert in construction. Mr. Heilman not only made the brick, but hauled them to the site and built that first small brick sanctuary himself. It served the congregation well for about a period of 30 years until it was rebuilt in 1887 and 1888. Again, Mr. Heilman played a leading role in the construction of the church, even crafting the lectern himself. Jesse Boger built a pulpit out of solid walnut. Ed Correll contracted to paint a mural in the rear of the church behind the altar, which still fascinates modern viewers because of its use of perspective and the great sense of depth that it gives. In 1975, members of the New Gilead congregation erected and dedicated a monument honoring the memory of Reverend Samuel Souther and in honor of his many achievements and during a lifetime of service to the Reformed Church. Reverend Souther, one of the pioneer members of the Reformed Church, preached in both Cabarrus and Rowan counties and was well known for being a minister at the old Coldwater Union Church on Gold Hill Road in Cabarrus County during the latter 1760s. The fourth of the great Reformed congregations in Rowan, Cabarrus, and Stanley County built a church in 1806 along Bear Creek Road, here in the eastern edge of Cabarrus County and the western edge of what is now Stanley County. It was Montgomery County when the church was first built. German settlers of both the Reformed and Lutheran faiths had been worshiping together in a union congregation on this same site, in this same area, for many years before 1806. In that year, under the leadership of the great Reformed minister, Reverend George Boger, they decided to erect a building of hewn pine logs on this site. Christopher Lyerly, who was a member of that congregation, donated the land for the site and served as the architect for that first church building. The church traces its heritage back to the old Dutch Buffalo Creek Church in 1745, as does St. John's Lutheran Church of Mount Pleasant. The Union people worshiped together as a congregation for many years on this same site, building a new church in 1878. Later, the Lutheran members of the congregation withdrew in 1906 to a location a short distance away where they built Bethl Lutheran Church and still worship there to this day. In 1928 and 9, the Reformed members who remained on this site decided to build a new brick church, the same church in which they worship to this date. In 1935, a grateful Bethl congregation erected a monument in the old Bethl Cemetery in honor and memory of Christopher Lyerly and his son Jacob Lyerly, both of whom were lifelong members of this congregation. Christopher Lyerly was a Revolutionary War soldier who fought under George Washington. He donated the first 100 acres on which this church is sited and also served as its first builder and architect. In 1848, his son Jacob Lyerly donated 5 additional acres of land to Bethl Church. In 1960, the North Carolina Grange honored this old church with the title of Rural Church of the Year. In 1803, a native-born son, Reverend George Boger, began to minister to the congregations here at Bethl Church, at Lower Stone, at Mount Zion in China Grove, and at Coldwater Church in Cabarrus County. Reverend Boger had been born in Old Mecklenburg County in 1782, in that portion which later became Cabarrus County. His life brings together many of the early ministers of that day. George Boger was baptized by Reverend Samuel Souther. He was then taught the ministry under the tutelage of Reverend Andrew Loritz, Reverend Samuel Wayberg, and the Lutheran minister C.A.G. Storch. He was ordained by Reverend Loritz at the Mount Zion Church in China Grove in 1803, and he served the congregations of this broad area until 1830. In 1847, health finally forced him to give up the ministry, and he died in 1865 at what was then the good old age of 82 years. During his long life, Reverend Boger managed to baptize 1,919 children. He performed wedding ceremonies for more than 200 couples. He performed more than 300 burial ceremonies, and he brought more than 600 persons into the church. He did all of that while traveling through a broad area by horseback and in wagons. In his person, he kept together all the churches of central North Carolina. In fact, a Reformed historian has written of him that it is in large part due to his dedication and ministry that the church survived in Cabarrus, Rowan, and Stanley counties. In 1906, the people of the community at Watts Crossroad in Cabarrus County decided to erect a Reformed church. It was appropriate that they named it Boger Church in honor of Reverend Boger and for all his many contributions to this area. In 1831, in an effort to strengthen the church in North Carolina, the 17 Reformed congregations then in the state came together to form a North Carolina classis or conference of Reformed churches. Our 4 local congregations were part of that group. The Reformed Church worked hard to get ministers for each of the churches, but not until 1843 did each of the churches have a regular pastor. The Reformed Church also began about that time through its classis to take some of its forward-thinking social positions. In 1839, the classis resolved that it was against both the use and manufacture of alcohol. Although that position damaged the local churches in some areas, the North Carolina classis refused to retreat from its high ground on that social position. The Civil War followed soon after and left North Carolina and her churches in a state of devastation and despair. coffers were empty. When the North Carolina classis met together after the war, the treasurer reported that there was only $319 in the treasury and that was worthless Confederate currency. Despite that, delegates at the conference resolved to give thanks for all that they owed, for their many blessings, and resolved that they would come together to attempt to preserve their spiritual heritage for their children and their generations. Following the war, prosperity returned to the Piedmont with the growth of cotton mills and the building of industry. Churches flourished. New Reformed churches were built throughout Rowan County, in Salisbury, Faith, and Rockwell, and in the Stokes Ferry Road community. In Concord in 1880, Reformed people began meeting in the local courthouse and worshiping there together. A few years later, they built a house of worship at the corner of Church and Mean Street in Concord. Finally, in 1923, the congregation built its present house of worship on North Church Street, the location they still occupy to this day. For many years, the Reverend Dr. Paul Barringer had preached to the Reformed congregations in eastern Cabarrus County. In 1894, Reverend Barringer saw a need for a new Reformed church in the town of Mount Pleasant to serve the many new families that had flocked to that growing community. Reverend Barringer was able, with the assistance of local Reformed congregations and local leading members of the Mount Pleasant community, to begin erection of the church in 1895. It was to become known as St. James Reformed Church. W.J. Heilig donated a lot for the first church and served on that first building committee with Dr. A.W. Moose and Mr. L.J. Foyle. With the assistance of the Bethl Bear Creek Reformed congregation, that early church was completed and dedicated by May of 1896 and ably served the growing congregation until 1923, when the present beautiful sanctuary was erected. The St. James congregation continues to serve the thriving Mount Pleasant community and continues the Reformed emphasis on missions, on service to the community, and on education. During that early period of expansion and growth, a new Reformed church was built on the old road from Concord to Salisbury and named in honor of Reverend John H. Keller, a leading early Reformed minister. In 1934, the Reformed Church merged with the Evangelical Church to form a new body, the Evangelical and Reformed, or E&R, Church. It was really a marriage of cousins because the Evangelical Church was composed of both Lutheran and Reformed elements and also shared the Reformed belief in missions and education. In 1957, the Evangelical and Reformed Church merged with the Congregational Christian churches. Although there were many organizational differences and certainly differences in historical background, the new united churches shared a common belief in the role and witness of the church in a changing world. It's often said that the foundations of education in Cabarrus County were laid in the Presbyterian schools in the western part of the county and here in the German schools in the eastern portion of the county. Both the Lutheran and Reformed churches, with their emphasis on education and missions, strongly supported that goal. In 1834, the North Carolina classis formed an education committee in an effort to guarantee that those of its young people who wanted an education would be able to have one. As part of that mission, in 1851, what was then called a high school was created in Newton, North Carolina. That high school became Catawba College and turned out more than 65 ministers for the Reformed faith. Although the college thrived except during the Civil War years, it appeared in 1923 that as a result of a need for increased funding and an improvement in its educational standard, the school might be lost. The Synod, however, with the encouragement of many of the local churches, came to its rescue, pledging to support the school and to support its improvement. As a result of a lot of hard work by many lay people and many of the leaders in the Reformed Church, people in the Salisbury area liked the idea of the Reformed School moving to their community. Land was offered and encouragement was given. In 1925, Catawba moved to Salisbury, where it's continued to thrive and to turn out young people in every profession, including ministers of the faith. The descendants of the Reformed people are justly proud of their rich heritage, but many would agree with the remarks of Reverend Milton Whitener at the 200th anniversary of Lowerstone Reformed Church in 1945, when he said this: "We do not live in the past, glorious though it may be. We live in the present for the future. As we pause in this celebration, let us catch something of the spirit of the fathers of this church, that we may serve as devotedly, as daringly, and as hopefully in our day as they did in theirs." Even as Catawba College was meeting the needs of the Reformed churches for ministers, Lutheran churches in the area were experiencing the same problem. Many of their ablest young people were leaving the state to be trained as ministers at seminaries in other states, and then remaining there during their careers. In order to deal with that need and that problem, the Lutheran Synod met in Concord on July 21st, 1852, to discuss the problem. As a result, they decided to found the Western North Carolina Male Academy at the nearby town of Mount Pleasant, and there train young people as those who would be able to join the ministry and later become Lutheran preachers. That decision changed the history of Lutheranism throughout the southern Piedmont, and it also changed the history of Mount Pleasant and its surrounding community. The story of the Lutheran schools of Mount Pleasant and the growth of the surrounding community is one for another day, but one that we hope to continue to tell. We invite you to be with us again as we continue to tell the story of this special place, this Cabarrus.